Do the engines on Sodor really have faces? And who other than the reader can see them?
My rule,
Says Wilbert,
is that faces are allowable in the book since the engines are on Sodor, where anything can happen and usually does, but that is not so in England.
Despite of course being a fictional island, considering how real Sodor was depicted, for the Reverend to say something as outlandish as this is nothing short of confusing. But what sense can we make of this? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing today. The quote-unquote rule is pretty self-explanatory, but even when we know what it is, it still raises several questions. For one thing, Edwards and Spong contradict this in the illustrations. More on that later. Throughout the years, people have come up with their own theories to make some sense of this rule. Some work, some don't, and today we'll be going over every theory this fandom has presented as well as my own perspective. So introductions out the way, let's begin. Theory 1. Retainment. Conjured up by shit Keanu Reeves, the way this theory works is that whenever an engine visits Sodor, they gain a face and keep the face when they leave. This fills a couple of holes in the initial rule, but also creates more in their place. Of course, we've seen real engines come to the island. City of Truro, Scotsman, Stepney, it lines up pretty well. But what about Green Arrow, or Mallard, or Albert? Or the Diesels in Escape, and why is his face on the back? It's so stupid. Like, how does this make any sense? Wait, what are we talking about? Illustration inconsistencies aside, this explains why in Book 12, the 8 famous engines, all the engines go to England and keep their faces. It's because they've travelled from Sodor. The same can be said about Book 29, Great Little Engines, where Sir Handel goes to the Tallyllyn Railway and gets hit in the face by a tree. Again, at face value, it makes sense because Sir Handel's travelled from Sodor. But then, right after that, when he returned to Sodor, he says this about Tallyllyn.
The other engines told me that he's on the mend and he'll be back at work soon.
How did they say anything if they haven't been to Sodor? Granted, this explanation is more tied into Sudrian conflict than anything, but it still gives some answers to what's already a nonsensical rule to the Railway series. One thing worth noting, however, is this illustration in Bluebells of England. What are the chances that this is on Sodor? Maybe it's at Vickerstown or Barrow at the very least. Or maybe this iconic illustration of the same story. Ultimately, it falls apart when you consider the fact Barrow is the first and only station in England that's even a part of the NWR's main line. But then we see Oliver escaping to Sodor, with a face before he's even arrived. So already, we're off to a very confusing start here. While this theory somewhat makes sense, when you look deeper into it, it just shoots itself in the foot. 650 words into the script already, and we're only just getting started. Fuck me. Theory 2. Dimensional Rift. This next theory comes from fellow friend of the channel, Taillamp Studios. However, it's very complicated, so I'll let him explain.
All the illustrations of the non-sentient engines are not a part of the same universe.
As much as I love Sam's videos, I think this theory scratches more heads than jokers. The one thing we have to remember regarding the Railway series is that this doesn't matter. But unlike the film, there's actually a semi-logical explanation here, to which, again, I'll let Sam explain.
When you think of a steam engine in real life, you don't typically picture them with a face. Typically, you picture them with a smoke box door. And since Audrey's universe is meant to take place in a real-life universe, then this theory doesn't seem all that surprising.
While this statement is true, and one I'll get more into later, two problems present themselves here. Firstly, why would some and not all engines have faces? And secondly, as said before, magic and especially parallel universes do not apply to the Railway series canonicity of things. While both us and Audrey know that Sodor isn't real, with how grounded the Reverend would develop the lore further down the line of his writing career, it might as well be a real place. And while yes, in real life you would typically see a smokebox door in place of the face, oh my god, it rhymed! Although the explanation's a bit complex, I do see where Sam is coming from. And although I somewhat agree with him, it's still very nonsensical to imply that there's a dimensional rift between Sodor and the rest of the real world. Theory 3. The Metaphor. This one's the most well-known and accepted on the list, but for those that don't know what it is, it's very simple. The general consensus is that the faces are a tool to tell the story. At face value, ha. This raises a lot of questions, but at the same time helps avoid the more complicated ones. I think Lemmy puts it best here.
When you think about how the Railway series started, it was Audrey, taking the puffing sounds of steam engines and the whistling sounds and making it into something that kind of resembled human behavior and personality. But really, the steam engines in Thomas are really steam engines before they're people. They may talk, they may have faces, but the things that the engines say and do are really means to an end. And that end is to show us what life is like on a railway. It's kind of like the phrase, if these walls could talk, right? I'm not actually saying the walls have faces on them. What I'm saying is a lot has happened in this room. There's a lot of amazing stories you could tell, and if only these walls could tell us those stories, right?
While unfortunately, like the other two theories, this one still suffers from the magic issue. However, from a storybook standpoint, it makes the most sense, and it's even implied in Tank Engine Man. Even going back as far as 1942, when the stories were just a means for the Reverend to entertain his ill son. It was when Wilbert put faces on this drawing that got Christopher asking questions, and consequently, these questions got the gears turning in Wilbert's head. The faces, notably the one sad face on Edward, were enough to tell the story. It isn't perfect though. Of course, like all theories mentioned in this video, this one still falls flat from a realistic standpoint, and it is logical, but only in a fictitious context. For example, Vivian of the Railway Series Book Club brings up a point when the group were talking about the story Leaves that, by adding wheel slip to the dialogue of the story, Johnny Morris adds to the personality that steam engines have.
What's the matter? What's the matter? What's the matter? Matter. What's the matter? What's the matter?
Doing this in the context of the story works as it's being told by one individual reader, improvising as he's reading along. But in the context of the engines being real, with their own individual voices, the storyteller approach feels less natural. So although this theory can work, it only goes as far as being a fictional construct, and is one where it's not worth overanalyzing if you want your sanity intact. Theory 4. Alive and moving. This one was a rather last minute addition, but Wiley brings it up in one of Unlucky Tug's live streams. It loosely ties back to the rule, but it suggests that the engines are only alive when actually in steam. Audrey personified the engines well enough in his writings, and if he put enough thought into what was already a flawed explanation, maybe it could have tied in pretty well with the context of the characters being machines. Speaking of, illustration 2 of Bluebells of England implies that the condition of an engine affects the face. But at the same time, Duke was left in the shed for 20 years and he was completely fine. I would make the point that Duke's face would have disappeared when he fell asleep, but it can't have. Toby had the same thing happen to him, albeit not nearly for as long. And the only reason he woke up was his crew opening the doors. The one thing to bear in mind here is that neither Toby nor Duke would still be in steam after their lines closed. This theory, annoyingly as much as the others, still suffers from the implication of magic. However, making sense of it is really a double-edged sword. On one hand, it makes sense, as the only time you can clean out the smoke box is when the engine isn't in steam. But on the other hand, it doesn't work, as there have been instances where engines are still sentient when idle. If we're taking illustrations literally with all of this, Henry's still sentient when his fireman opens the smoke box door, although it's shown to be shut. How does he open it? There's no dart, so does he twist Henry's nose like a door handle? Does he just use a fucking crowbar to open the smoke box like a safe? Can you take the face off of an engine? Move on, Sam, for Christ's sake. The more you think about the logic of the faces, the more head-scratching it becomes. Some see them as just being alive without overthinking it. Others write them off as being a figment of our imagination. And some do overthink the human characteristics of a steam engine to the point of throwing organs into the mix. No matter what angle you look at it, seemingly nothing makes sense. To tell you the truth, I started the script for this video in mid-February, and now here we are nearing the end of April. Granted, when writing every script, you tend to take breaks so as to not burn yourself out, but considering it's been 2 months since I started it, it's clear that this subject in particular has been exhausting to talk and think about. So, what's my hypothesis? The way I see it is that the faces are just that, faces. No organs, no blood, no biofusion or literal humanized bollocks of any kind. They're just faces on machines. And so, how do I explain some having faces and some not? Well, the reason is that Wilbert just told the illustrators not to put faces on the engines he requested. In fact, the whole rule stems from Wilbert's own models not having faces, and the way I see it, it's essentially justification to why that is. As I said multiple times in this video, Sodor has always been written as if it was a real place, to the point of Wilbert writing an entire book detailing the island's history, which goes back as far as the 1900s. I'm also doing audiobook chapters on this book, so go check that out if you haven't already. Please, I'd really appreciate it if you did. So for him to all of a sudden declare that the faces just don't exist outside of Sodor is very left field, considering, again, just how real this island was. With all this in mind, the decision of engines of, say, the Bluebell not having faces makes the most sense as being a stylistic choice on Wilbert's part, and also Christopher to a lesser extent. One thing to bring up as well, and one that I don't know the origins of, is that Wilbert apparently stated that the illustrations are inaccurate and that we mustn't take them literally. Again, I don't know exactly where he said this, but Unlucky Tug brought it up in one of his videos. Annoyingly, he didn't show or say where Wilbert said this, but considering the effort Nick puts in his videos, he definitely didn't just pull this out of his ass. But all the same, clarification would be nice. As Sam said earlier, you wouldn't typically see a face on a real engine, would you? And while this is very contradictory for the Reverend to say, but Scarlobby has flat out said not to be real in Book 14, Little Old Engine. With this in mind, the Reverend probably did the whole no faces in England thing to represent real life engines in a real life setting. Again, like Sam said earlier, these illustrations are depicting real life engines. But in the context of the stories, the reader would picture all of these engines to have faces. And while the idea of only some having faces is really fucking stupid to think about, from an artistic standpoint, it does work, but not when you overthink it. So, this video's certainly been a very bumpy ride. So much so that it's taken me almost 3 months to actually finish it. To conclude by saying that this subject has been confusing would be redundant, as I've made that point very clear throughout the video. So as always, I'll ask for your stance on this. How far do you guys take the faces, or do you just not overthink it? Sound off in the comments below. As convoluted as these theories may be, feel free to believe any of them, and I'm by no means belittling those who've created them. Apart from you, because you're an asshole. I personally prefer my explanation of it just being a stylistic choice, but if you disagree, then that's totally fine. And as always, I hope you all enjoyed. You've been watching Scrapyard Studios, and I will see you soon.